have lasted 2 decades in power without European money, acceptance, and political credibilities. All the things places that know better, like the Baltics and Poland, were saying never to give him.
Let's talk then about what Europe could do, should do, as you say. EU countries ready to impose new sanctions against Russia as soon as next week, we're told. This is at a meeting of EU foreign ministers. What are your hopes from that?
Not much, I have to say. I'm an incorrigible optimist by nature, but looking at the European record dealing with Putin's dictatorship, I'm getting less and less optimistic. Europe has become a laughing stock when it comes to dealing with Putin. And note that I say Putin, not Russia, because this has nothing to do home and abroad with chemical weapons. And Europe still talks about wanting dialogue with Putin. They already had dialogue. Europe said, release Navalny. Putin said, go to hell. Dialogue is over. It's now time for action. The targeted sanctions on Putin's henchmen and oligarchs and their families, and kicking Russia out of these institutions, international institutions. It abuses and corrupts. But unfortunately, I would expect some kind of, diluted version of the sanctions that will not go into the core of Putin's power, because it's a criminal mafia that only cares about money and the power needed to get money and keep it.
What of the new man in the White House? Do you have hopes that something will change now because of President Joe Biden being in post?
We heard strong rhetorics from the White House. Again, those were strong words, but I'm waiting to see actions. And naturally, Biden had to deal with so many foreign challenges, and I'm not sure that Russia will be a top priority. But he had plenty of experience dealing not only with Putin's dictatorship, but also with Soviet Union when Biden was younger. I trust his instincts, and I expect that America will resume its leadership of the free world, and hopefully it will have positive influence on Europe, especially on countries like Germany and Italy that are still trying to continue business as usual with Putin.
Garry Kasparov, long-time democracy campaigner, former world champion chess master, of course. Alan Posner, he has little faith in the strength of EU sanctions if and when they come, or indeed the coordination of them. Are you equally doubtful?
Yes, I have to say, I was sort of nodding all the time. I think every word he said is true. I mean, it's amazing. Navalny is in jail and his would-be murderers are running free. That says all you need to know about Putin. Meanwhile, Germany pretend to even want to develop a policy which confronts Mr. Putin, if at the same time we're begging him to give us more of his gas. It is really... I'm ashamed, quite frankly, about our whole performance. I mean, the other day, Mr. Borrell, who is the foreign policy chief of the European Union, he was in Moscow, and while he was there for talks, they chucked European diplomats out of Moscow. And instead of saying, well, I'm going, that's it, thank you, friends, he stayed on to let himself be humiliated by the Russian foreign minister. And I can't say how much I agree with Kasparov and how terrible I feel that Germany especially has decided basically to continue independency of Mr. Putin.
Just on Nord Stream 2, I anticipated you might bring it up.
Yeah, it's a hobby horse, I admit.
It is nearly finished. So what realistically could Germany do about that now?
Well, I don't know, there's about 50 kilometers that's still to be laid, and Germany could say, we'll put it on hold. Right. As they said in Afghanistan, make it the completion of the pipeline conditional on certain things happening in Russia. That's perfectly possible. I mean, I have nothing against the pipeline working sometime, but not now. So actually, the fact that it's almost finished would give us, if we only had the guts to face up to Mr. Putin, a very good sort of deal, a very good...
But we've heard Garry Kasparov's take on it. He was admiring of it, and clearly, there must have been huge doubts among his supporters as to whether that was the right thing to do. What do you think?
I agree. I think it was a huge kind of... it was obviously a decision on his part to make a statement, but obviously he knew what was at stake, and I very much admire him for going back and taking that responsibility to highlight, the regime that Putin has put in place, as Alan has described. So I am also, like Kasparov, very, very very kind of admirative of him being the man of the moment, if you want, to sort of take on that fight and to highlight the problem. And I like Alan, a very kind of negative, if you want, have a negative reaction of the EU and its idea of putting in sanctions and not sort of taking on Putin and denouncing and really being strong and sort of letting Putin get away with it. So yes, I very much admire, and he's paying a high price for it. So it's very, very brave on his part. And the EU, is kind of all over the place, unfortunately, in kind of, being strong against big sort of regimes who kind of treat it badly and don't listen and do what they want in a way. So yeah, it's a very difficult situation.
Just to let you know that Mr. Navalny is standing up in court as I speak, and is making his final appeal before this verdict in this case against him over the allegation that he called this World War II veteran a traitor. He's been continuing to sound defiant, talk about what was decided in Europe to a degree, who he regards as having any validation in terms of making a decision today. Obviously, as soon as we get a little bit more out of the court. In fact, I'm just reading something now. He's closing arguments in his appeal, and this is what he said, and I quote, "Europe's Human Rights Court said the initial trial verdict was fabricated, and then they made a ruling to free me, but I am tried, and I am tried, and I'm tried, and tried." In other words, every time he feels he's been through a court process, he has to go through another one. And he concludes, "It seems very strange." We'll obviously bring you more from that Moscow court as and when. The new US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, has talked exclusively to the BBC about the Biden administration's approach to the world. He was speaking to Yalda Hakim, who asked him what President Biden meant when he told international leaders that America was back.
Well, I think you heard the president say it. America's back. He last spoke at the Munich Security Conference 2 years ago in 2019, and he said America would be back, and now he's president, and America is back. But what does that mean? It means that we're determined once again to engage in the world, to show up again, because in the absence of American engagement, in the absence of American leadership, then one of two things happens. Either some other country tries to take our place and probably does so in a way that doesn't advance the common interests and values of the democratic world, or no one does. But it's also imperative that American engagement and American leadership be for the purpose of finding new ways to cooperate among countries, because every single one of the major challenges we face, whether it's climate change, whether it's this pandemic, whether it's the spread of a dangerous weapon, not a single nation acting alone can deal with them effectively. We have to find ways to work together.
You've been speaking to European foreign ministers on rejoining the Iran nuclear deal. Can you clarify what has been
clear that if Iran returns to compliance with its obligations under the nuclear agreement, the United States would do the same thing. But then we would work with our partners, both to lengthen and strengthen the agreement and to confront other issues, including its destabilizing activities in the region, its ballistic missile programs, that need to be addressed. We now have an invitation from the European Union to have an informal meeting of the so-called Joint Commission of the Iran nuclear agreement. So the United States, the European partners, Russia, China, and Iran have all been invited, and we intend to be there.
The New York Times is reporting that you're taking limited steps to let up pressure on Iran to get them to the table. How do you respond to criticism that these are upfront concessions?
No upfront concessions. What we have is this. We have a policy in recent years of so-called maximum pressure on Iran that has not produced results. In fact, the problem has gotten worse. Iran is now much closer to being able to produce on short order enough fissile material for a nuclear weapon. That so-called breakout time had been pushed past 1 year by the nuclear agreement. It's now down, based on published reports, just a few months. Has been not standing down, but acting up in the region with various destabilizing actions, attacks on our own forces in Iraq and elsewhere, on our partners. And so the problem has gotten worse, not better.
A portion of that conversation with Antony Blinken. He also criticised China for failing to share information that might shed light on the origins of the coronavirus. And he also told the BBC that a better health security system was needed to spot pandemics before they fully emerged, and countries must be transparent in swapping information. Staying with the pandemic, Here's a question to be considered. How many coronavirus vaccines should rich countries send to poorer ones, and when? Well, G7 leaders on Friday pledged $7.5 billion to the COVAX vaccine sharing initiative. But their priority will still be to make sure their own citizens get the jab first. Among those making the case for developing countries to receive them before developed countries have completed their programs is Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, the incoming Director General of the World Trade Organization, and the first woman and African to take on that role. She's been speaking to my colleague Martha Carney about vaccines and trade.
I think what we need to make sure is that having created the COVAX facility, countries are not then in a bid to serve all their nationals at once, perhaps bidding away the scarce supplies of vaccines from poorer countries or from the COVAX facility, so that we can have a more equitable distribution. So it's one thing to have the facilities, another to make sure it gets access to vaccines that it can send to countries. So this is where the UK, the Europe, US, and all the other rich countries need to be much more to be helpful.
What the United Kingdom has said, the government has said, is that it plans to donate surplus vaccines to the developing world. Is that enough?
That is welcome, and the COVAX facility has a vaccine exchange, but I don't think we should wait to get surplus when other people have been served. I think any donations that are coming must come now. The reason is very simple. It's in the interest of rich countries as well as poor countries to have equitable access. A study that was done by the International Chambers of Commerce recently shows that if by middle of this year, rich countries have populations and poor countries haven't vaccinated theirs, the world is going to lose $9 trillion. It will cost the world $9 trillion. The global economy, and half of that cost will be borne by rich countries. So we need to just understand that it's in the self-interest of both and poor to have equitable access to vaccines. Otherwise, all countries lose, all people lose.
Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, the incoming Director General of the World Trade Organization. A brief thought from you both. Philia Allam, does she have a point?
She does. I really do think she has a point, and I think that we need to make it accessible to rich and developing countries. The one question I have is whether, we have the capability of constructing places where factories where they can be made, for more of them, so that we can get them to developing countries. The idea of waiting for the surplus seems to me, problematic. I think we need to do it now, really.
Alan Posner, we're hearing positive messages from developed countries. Are they point here?
Yeah, well, I heard Mr. Iweala say that, if developed countries have vaccinated their whole population by the middle of the year, the developing world hasn't got any, then we're in trouble. One of the most developed countries in the world. I don't even have a date for a vaccination. We've vaccinated something like, 4% of our population. I know a 90-year-old woman who hasn't been vaccinated, and her care people. In principle, I agree with Ms. Iweala, but I just wish my country or the European Union would get its act together. Then I could start sort of saying, oh yeah, well, we have to be, generous. But we're generous. That the UK is managed, let alone Israel.
Yes, you sum up the arguments very neatly. It's 23 minutes past the hour now.
We hope that we can provide an inspiration to everybody, not only women, but to everybody that has a dream, that has a big dream, and that is willing to work hard to make that dream come true. Something that all of us that have made our way up here have done all throughout our lives. And I can tell you, the hard work certainly did pay off. I've only been up here a few weeks, actually, about 3 weeks I've been in space, and this is